First thing I'd like to do, of course, is pay respects that we're on Maori land, and to acknowledge the struggles of all Indigenous people here and everywhere to preserve our cultural ways of knowing to preserve our lands. So I'd like to just start with that as a visitor and somebody who wants to remember that something that for me is very important, and I know for others here. Let me begin now with this lecture with a couple of quotes, 3 quotes. The first one is Merleau-Ponty, who says, "The body is our medium for having a world." Michel Foucault stated that the body is also directly involved in a political field. Power relations have an immediate hold upon it. They invest it, they mark it, they train it, torture it, force it to carry out tasks, to perform ceremonies, to emit signs. And Paulo Freire stated that I know with my entire body, with feelings, with passion, and also with reason. It is my entire body that socially knows. I cannot, in the name of exactness or rigor, negate my body, my emotions, nor my feelings. In Pedagogy and the Politics of the Body, Sherry Shapiro, as many other feminists have before her, contends any approach committed to human liberation must seriously address the body as a site for both oppression and liberation. Yet seldom is the significance of the body made central to discussions of emancipatory pedagogy. As such, educational efforts to invent or to reinvent the social and material conditions within the classroom are often devoid of any discussion or consideration of the significance of the flesh in mediating conditions of teaching and learning. That is, unless the discussion turns to something like classroom management, and which always serves as this kind of convenient euphemism, right? That's both covert and overt regulation of the control of students' corporality. So there's a sense of that's the major way in which the thought of the body comes into place, unless you're a physical education person. And then, then you're supposed to be all over it. Yeah. Meanwhile, the classroom exists as an arena where abstract knowledge and its constructions are objectified, along with students who are expected to acquiesce to the alienating functions, limiting rationality and technocratic instrumentalism. Hence, the production of knowledge is neither engaged nor presented as a historical and collective process occurring in the flesh, with all of its central capacities for experiencing and responding to the world. Instead, as Christopher Becky argues in Wicked Bodies, I love the name of that book, Wicked Bodies, the flesh, the material aspects of the body, is seen as a hindrance and must be overcome, negated, and transcended, as if it were not involved in the act of knowing at all. But we, as educators, know that teaching and learning can invoke a multitude of sensations and responses, including excitement, pain, joy, anger, pride, and frustration. And with this clearly in mind, Paulo Freire often referred to these very human responses when he considered the process of studying. Studying, he said, is a demanding occupation in the process of which we will encounter pain and pleasure, victory, defeat, doubt, and happiness, all physical sensations of our body. And if any of you are working on a master's degree or a doctoral degree, you know damn well that there's a lot of pain involved in this process. I have never seen a doctoral student go through or a master's student go without dealing with just the pain, and sometimes of having to do the reading that you've got to do and sit down and spend so many hours in isolation trying to write a text. The notion of students as embodied and integral beings has received and limited attention in discussions of classroom praxis, particularly in the US where I'm from. Missing even in multicultural discussions of pedagogy is a more complex understanding of our humanity and the significance of the body to intellectual formation. Generally, such discussions have been left to those educators whose tendency has been to overemphasize the role of subjectivity or fall into this over-psychologizing of the self. No matter how well-meaning, then, this view often fails to address the material conditions and issues of power and privilege at work in the lives of historically disenfranchised and oppressed students. The historical absence of the body has been so because bringing the body into critical discussion is considered potentially disruptive and subversive to the social order of schooling. Grounded in such a worldview, many educators assume that teaching and learning are solely this cognitive act. And as such, teachers need not concern themselves with the physical nature of their students unless one is deemed as inappropriate. So if students are deemed as inappropriate, then they call in the officials or the psychologists, and sometimes in the US even the police, to restrain and, somehow fix the problem. So that's the way that generally anything that is considered as part of the body is dealt with. To support students then in becoming full subjects of history, which of course is what Freire often spoke about, right? He also urged teachers to grapple with the fact that students construct knowledge through the multitude of collective interactions of the body with the world. Amanda Sinclair reminds us similarly that the immediate impact of a person's body or another on another is profound. So, when we just see each other, we make up some notion about who that person is, some response our body has to each other, even though we may not necessarily pay attention to it, right? So she goes on to say that a great deal happens before a person opens their mouth. Emotions are aroused, judgments are made, comfort or discomfort levels are established well in advance of verbal communication. We unconsciously or consciously register and make judgments about stature and voice. Bodies elicit feelings of excitement and admiration, attraction and desire, envy and distaste. So people are responding. When we talk about stereotypical responses, racializing responses, often what we're talking about are not necessarily what happens, it happens before there's any kind of relationship or engagement. The material conditions and in histories of students are made visible on the bodies. Their histories of survival are often witnessed on their skin, their teeth, their hair, their gestures, their speech, and the movement of their arms and legs. In a myriad of ways, then, Haraway reminds us that bodies are maps of power and identity. If this is so, then teachers must work to engage students' physical realities more substantively in an effort to forge an emancipatory practice of education. It's not enough to rely on the abstracting learning processes where only the analysis of words and texts are privileged in the construction of knowledge. Such an educational process of estrangement functions to alienate students from the natural world around them, from themselves, and from each other. Hence, teachers and students must labor in the flesh. That is to say that teaching and learning must be anchored in a material understanding of our human existence as a starting place for classroom praxis and our struggle to reinvent the world. Freire argued that this is vital to a critical pedagogy in that we learn things about the world by acting and changing the world around us. It is through the process of change, of transforming the material world from which we emerge, where creation of the cultural and historical world takes place. This transformation of the world is done by us while it also remakes us. And those who are familiar with Marx know that element of making the world, we make the world as the world makes us, is fundamentally, underneath that way of thinking in Freire's work. However, there's nothing automatic about social change. And this is an important piece. There's nothing automatic about acting or engaging in a socially just way. Nor is it a process that can solely rely on calculating logic or cold rationality. When the body's sentient forces overwhelmingly shape our experiences and responses to social structures, so too, struggles in the name of social justice must hold steadfast the fullness of our human existence. In our efforts then to understand the process of teaching, learning has to be acknowledged as human labor that takes place within our bodies and the totality of our beings as we strive to make sense of the material conditions and social relations of power that shape our particular histories. In Teaching to Transgress, Bell Hooks speaks to this issue when she says, "I have always been acutely aware of the presence of my body in those settings that in fact invite us to invest so deeply in a mind-body split, so that in a sense you're almost always at odds with the existing structure, whether you are a black woman, student, or professor. But if you want to remain, you've got, in a sense, to remember yourself. Because to remember yourself is to see yourself always as a body in a system that has not become accustomed to your presence or to your physicality. And I wanted to just stop for a second and say that part of what we see within the academy, within the university, is exactly that phenomenon, which of course is what she was speaking about. And you know, if you think about it, it hasn't been 100 years, it hasn't, 50 years that women have really become a presence in the university. It's been less that folks of color have begun to, that the African American, that black, Latino, that other indigenous people have begun to have a place in the university. It hasn't been that long. And so in fact what we understand is that we come into a context that was not made for us. It was not, it wasn't for us to survive. And so part of the struggle has been, is how do we transform it and how do we engage it? What this whole work is about is that we're not able to do it unless we engage it as a physical phenomenon. Through such an understanding, then, teachers can begin to build a practice of education where students are not being asked to confront themselves and each other as strangers, but rather as fully embodied human beings from the moment that they enter into the classroom. This is to say that a critical praxis of the body must seek to contend in the flesh with the embodied histories of the disenfranchised, as well as the social material forces that shape the conditions in which we teach and learn. Again, Freire speaks to the undeniable centrality of the body in the act of knowing when he says the importance of the body is indisputable. The body moves, acts, rememorizes the struggle for liberation. The body in some desires, it points out, it announces, it protests. It curves itself, rises, designs, and remakes the world. And its importance has to do with a certain sensualism contained by the body, even in connection to cognitive ability. It's absurd to separate the rigorous act of knowing the world from the body's passionate ability to know. But it is precisely this sensualism, with its revolutionary potential to nurture self-determination and the empowerment of students as both individuals and social beings, which is systematically stripped away from the educational process of public schools. Most students already well versed in maintaining a gray, or most teachers already versed in maintaining a gray kind of world of unsexy knowing, are well placed to take up the challenge of policing expressions of passion, excitement, and physicality within the classroom, particularly when teaching youth. Conservative ideologies of social control, historically linked to puritanical views of the body as evil, sensual pleasure as sinful, and passions as corrupting to the sanctity of the spirit, continue to be reflected in the narrow, rule-based pedagogical policies and practices of schooling today. The sensuality of the body is discouraged in schools through the prominent practice of immobilizing students' bodies within hard chairs and desks that contain and restrict their contact with each other and their environment. Vivian Leroy contends the body has not usually gained a lot of space in our educational system. It is nothing more than what allows us to remain seated for hours and to move from one classroom to another and to meet the requirements. 90% of the time spent in schools is typically in a state of immobility. Learning, and I say this to you as you're sitting here immobilized. I tried to get my music, it wouldn't work. Learning is reduced to an airborne exchange of knowledge between different minds. The knowledge of the teacher's mind is transmitted to the learners, defined as minds able to receive new knowledge or not. Leroy further argues that this tradition of fettered bodies is anchored in three paradigmatic figures: Socrates, Christianity, and Pavlov's dog. In the classical tradition, the sensual body is quickly subordinated to the mind, while ideas are privileged over the senses. In Christianity, the separation between the body and the soul constitutes an essential pedagogical concern. In the Pavlovian model, the body is transformed into an instrumentalized object to be manipulated and controlled through external stimulus in the process of learning. And I don't know how old you all are, but I had kids when the behaviorists were really taking over education, right? So that should give you some sense of how old I am. And an example of that was that my kids were given M&Ms when they spelled words right, or M&Ms if they answered the question right, you know, or little stars. And so the kids would come home and say, oh, Mommy, I got 10 M&Ms today, or I didn't get any M&Ms. And so what we see is this very interesting kind of behavioral practices that have been part of the educational process, especially with young children. Such views of teaching and learning then ultimately lead to pedagogical practices that do emotional and psychological violence through their erasure of the body and the annihilation of the flesh in the traditional rubric of classroom life. Accordingly, inequalities are reproduced through class, racialized, gendered, and heterosexist perceptions and distortions of male and female bodies, perceptions and distortions that are embodied within the pedagogy of even the most well-meaning teachers. So sometimes teachers will do and say things to the students, and it's not that they're bad people, it's just that there's a kind of normalized, there's these commonsensical notions about how, what is a good student, or what a good boy or a good girl should be like, and then that gets reproduced in what the teacher is willing to affirm a student for, or not affirm them, or punish them, right? Consequently, then, students from communities where the senses of the body, with all its spontaneities, are given greater primacy in the act of knowing and being, they're often coerced into sacrificing their knowledge of the body's sensuality, their creativity, and their vitality in favor of an atomized, analytical, and instrumental logic of being. In light of this, we as teachers need to reflect on what bodies we give permission to in our classrooms, and the extent to which we let those bodies speak while we let other bodies not speak. Such reflections may be, for example, key to explaining the overwhelming tendency of teachers in the U.S. and school officials to label African American or Black and Chicano students as hyperactive or suffering from attention deficit disorder. So when we look at the statistics, what we find is particularly Black boys and Latino boys have a higher incidence of being sent, for more testing around attention deficit disorder. Similarly, then, Susie O'Brien argues that the corporal, physical, and sexual realms are unwelcome intrusions into the everyday world of the classroom. The systematic disembodiment of students within the process of learning begins early in academic formation. Despite child development theories that assert that human beings are sexual beings even before birth, sexuality as an ever-present phenomena is systematically suppressed and denied within the four walls of the classroom. This is the case even at puberty, when adolescent bodies are particularly sensitive to heightened and confusing sensations. I want you to stop to think and remember yourselves when you were 14, 15, and 16 years old. Right? Lots of stuff going on there. Seldom do teachers, many who are not particularly comfortable with their own sexuality, critically engage questions of sexuality beyond the often repeated cliche of raging hormones. I don't know if you use that. I don't know what terms are interchangeable, but you get what the raging hormones is about, right? Usually in terms of teen conduct, you go into a teacher lounge where they eat, and they're talking about the teenagers, and you will invariably hear them talking about the raging hormones. Meanwhile, students are not only pedagogically abandoned, but also left at the mercy of the media and corporate pirates that very deliberately and systematically prey upon the field of powerful bodily sensations, emotions, and stirrings of youth. Henry Giroux, who's done a lot of work in this particular area, argues that in the slick world of advertising, teenage bodies are sought after the exchange value they generate in the marketplace. And an adolescent sexuality is marketed then that offers a marginal exoticism and ample pleasures for the largely male consumer. Commodification reifies and fixates the complexity of youth and the range of possible identities they might assume, while simultaneously exploiting them as fodder for the logic of the marketplace. Frightened by their own ambivalence and the physicality of student bodies, educational policymakers institute practices that coerce teachers into silence, rigidly limiting discussion of the most significant aspect of our humanity, and despite the difficulties and hardships then that silence creates in relationship to many students. And I'm thinking here how LGBTQ students have a high incidence of suicide. I don't know if here in New Zealand it's the same, but in the US they have a higher incidence of suicide. Schools, like many churches, then act as moral leaders, policing and repressing the body's participation. The minimalist approach of schools then in this area of human sexuality can be contrasted with other parts of the world where straightforward facts about the birds and bees are considered a pedagogical imperative. So if we go to Sweden, for example, compulsory sex education has been in place since 1956, given their recognition of sex as just a natural human act and the frank acknowledgement that most people become sexually active before they're 20. Toward this end, students learn at an early age about their sexuality, reinforcing a more open and positive view of sex and the body. Curriculum begins at age 6 with anatomy, and from 12 on, then the topics are more geared towards developing tools for responsibility and having responsible sexual lives. The outcome of that is that Sweden's rate of teen pregnancy and sexually transmitted disorders or diseases, is among the lowest in the world. So part of what we're seeing is that, there's this notion that if you talk about it, that the young people are going to, well, we can't talk. This is part of the conservatives, right? That if we talk about sex, then they're going to go out and they're all going to be, as if they weren't already engaging these questions. And anyway. We have a lot to remedy, and one of the best ways to remedy it is to really listen to youth in relationship to what's happening to their lives and what they're actually experiencing, rather than deciding for them that we know what's going on with them in terms of their bodies. The issue of teen pregnancy also illustrates how schooling practices and policies associated to the body are inextricably linked to gendered ideologies of power and control. Sinclair reminds us that schools, like most institutions, are only able to assimilate women's bodies so long as they conform to kind of a neutral or desexualized form. Young teen mothers violate this norm by bringing attention to the femaleness, their sexuality, and the difference from their male norms. Hence, teen pregnancy is addressed by exiling these young women from the school campus to an alternative location, often silenced and unseen, while the young fathers are left virtually untouched by the same system. This is, and I can speak to this personally. I was, at 16 years old, I was pregnant, and so when I was in high school, I was taken out, and I couldn't graduate with the rest of my class. There was never any discussion about this. It was just, this is what you had to do, because it was almost like it was contagious. Like if we were on the campus, then maybe everybody was going to be getting pregnant. Instead of dealing with some more structural questions of what happens to young people when they live in poverty, and how many outlets do we have for expression. Anyway. Let me just get a drink. Salud. So missing even in the university then is a willingness to contend with the sexuality of students in the process of their academic formation, despite the fact that intense desires are played out in the university classroom. In keeping with the mind-body split, educators readily ignore the manner in which learning works as a visceral and sensual level, at a visceral and sensual level. Consequently, the severing of the body's desires and sensations from the construction of knowledge interferes dramatically with students' capacity for self-knowledge. Similarly, such practices also thwart our knowledge of the other, rendering us alienated and estranged to any human suffering that exists outside of the particular and limited scopes of our own identities, whether linked to gender, ethnicity, sexuality, or skin color. In fact, Spender argues that the absence of pedagogical engagement with the body can inhibit the development of empathy and respect for those deemed as other. Students outside are objectified, alienated, and domesticated into passive roles. Schools discourage us all of thinking about the body. This not only interferes then with the achievement, but it sabotages social agency. So, in critical pedagogy or in most, education that we think about social justice, the whole issue is around social agency. We talk about the empowerment of students, right? This is a very common discourse in my area. And what I always say is that we don't empower anybody. The best that we can do is we can create the conditions for empowerment. For people we undergo the empowerment as a process of our lived experience and our relationships with others. So if parts of ourself are not able to be engaged, then part of what is going on is only a partial social agency is permitted. This is particularly visible when existing emotional and physical needs of students are ignored in an overriding effort to obtain their obedience and their conformity. Yet in spite of major institutional efforts to control the body's desire, their pleasures, and mobility within the classroom, students seldom surrender their bodies completely or acquiesce readily to authoritarian practices which in themselves provide the impetus for resistance. Instead, many students engage in the construction of their own cultural forms of resistance, which may or may not always function in their best interest. More often than not, then expressions of student resistance are enacted through counterculture alterations of their body, be they clothing and hairstyle, posturing, the manner of walking, a way of speaking, even their own vocabulary, right? Because youth, if you want to be close to youth if you want to stay hip. Because I'll tell you, a few generations down, if you're not listening to what they're saying, you're not going to understand what is going on in terms of how they're structuring their world and how they're thinking about it. But they do this also, through tattooing and piercing. These are all just ways in which they're expressing themselves. These represent not only acts of resistance, but alternative ways of experiencing and knowing the world, generally perceived by officials as both transgressive and disruptive to the social order. Such views of students are exacerbated by what Giroux contends is a new form of representational politics that emerged in media culture fueled by degrading visual depictions of youth as criminal, sexually decadent, drug-crazed, and illiterate. In short, youth are viewed as a growing threat to the public order. Now, I want you to just stop for a moment there. Let's just, what is a consequence of creating notions that youth are disruptive and a threat to the social order? What we have to look at is that at this point, we have a tremendous youth unemployment rate. We have an increasing rate of our youth being incarcerated. And so there's it may seem like we're just talking about, an issue, an abstract issue here, but what I want to say and what I want to get across is that the way we think, for example, about youth and about their lives have consequences, very material consequences on their lives, and consequences in terms of public policy. Teachers whose bodies are similarly restricted, alienated, and domesticated by their workplace are under enormous pressure to follow strict policies and procedures for classroom conduct, while they're expected to dispense this kind of prepackaged curricula instead of employing more creative and critical approaches grounded in the actual needs of students. Given the impact then of disembodied practices, teachers generally experience this uphill battle in meeting standardized mandates, which systematically extricate extricate students' bodies from the equation of their learning. Nowhere is this more apparent than in low-income working-class communities across the nation, where teaching to the test has become the curriculum of choice, even in many colleges and universities. So I don't, you know, the U.S. is this big country with all of these students, right? But what we find now is we see the same social class. You have like almost we often say that it's more of a caste system. We say it's a social system, but because the way that the education is set up, if you go to community college, for example, it's more than likely that you will have a very, very difficult time in terms of transferring. So it's already set up. And unless there are educators who are taking seriously your desire to continue your school, it's very easy to get stuck and not continue on. Along then with this teaching to the test approach are notions of gender and sexuality and race that are deeply sedimented into the body and highly resistant to change. This constitutes knowledge that is habitual and unexamined. Its outcome includes repressive educational policies and practices that marginalize the knowledge and languages of oppressed populations, infantilize adult students, criminalize youth of color, and consider suspicious ideas or uses of the body that are perceived as existing outside of a narrow mainstream view of normalcy. Even when teachers struggle within the classroom to implement more liberating strategies, they are often forced to become these masters of deception, saying what the principal or the district office wishes them to hear, whoever's direct, I don't know what your term, the principal, do you use principal in your schools? While doing behind doors what they believe is more democratic. Unfortunately, having to shoulder that hidden physical stress of duplicity can drive some of the most effective teachers out of the field. We have a high attrition rate of teachers. I mean, we have a big population, but we have a high attrition rate. Over 50% of teachers that begin by the 5th year have left the profession. So we know that something is not working, something is going on in the ways, partly in the very nature of teacher education, but in the very structure of the labor of teaching. And often that's not engaged, the sense that teachers are workers, and how do we understand the labor that teachers are involved in and the conditions under which teachers labor. What cannot be overlooked here is the manner in which authoritarian practices are designed not only to blindfold students and lead them to a domesticated future, but also to alienate and estrange teachers from their own labor. Concerned with the need to restore greater freedom, joy, creativity in the classroom, Freire urged teachers to critically reject their domesticating role and work to challenge the authoritarianism of standard policies and practices of pedagogy, curriculum, and school administration. This, he argued, requires an open process of dialogue, for in classrooms when the door are closed, it is difficult to have the world unveiled. And sometimes teachers feel that way. They feel like I have to close the door because I can't have an honest, even an honest discussion with my students if somebody comes by and I'm doing something that they don't consider to be part of the curriculum, But in fact, that is very stressful on teachers. It's very stressful. And one of the biggest problems we deal with in the U.S. is a kind of infantilizing also of teachers. The sense that teachers that they're not intellectuals, that somehow they're supposed to just be technicians. And so teaching is all about being a technical process or instrumental process, rather than teachers as intellectuals, who are thinking and engaging. And I don't care what you're teaching. I don't care if you're teaching little tiny kids, or you're teaching physical education, or you're teaching, the arts, or you're teaching math. In any context where we're teaching, there's a pedagogical process, and teachers are intellectuals because they have to think carefully about how they engage their students. And I think that often that piece is lost. There's this attitude that certain subject matters are more important than other subject matters. A critical praxis of the body then is salient to rethinking university education, where there seems to be little pedagogical tolerance for the emotional needs of adult learners. Somewhere in the intellectual history of the West, There developed this wrong-headed notion or idea that the mind and the heart are antagonists, that scholarship must be divested of emotion, that spiritual journeys must avoid intellectual concerns. This tradition sets an expectation that professors and students compartmentalize themselves within the classroom without any serious concern for the manner in which the very essence of university education is often tied to major moments of life transitions. Students are being asked to make major intellectual commitments and material investments related to the direction of what has become more and more an uncertain future. Simultaneously, teachers, let me start that again. Simultaneously, students are expected then to engage with their studies and research as objective, impartial observers, even when the object of their study is intimately linked to conditions of human suffering. I mean, we don't think of it, you know, people will studying poverty, right? And they do it in this kind of distance way. If they understood the impact of poverty on people's lives and suffering, I think what you would have is a kind of study that's much more fuller and that would engage with the social phenomenon in ways that we might actually find ways to begin to transform those conditions, because it would mean that we would have to engage with the larger structural realities that are at work with respect to poverty. Freire further argues that the traditional academic expectation of the university reinforces pedagogical myths, such as that feelings corrupt research and its findings, that intuition should be feared, that emotion and passion must be negated, and the science and technology should rule. These myths end in convincing many that they should be more neutral in terms of their actions, and more objective and more efficient if they really want to get down to the, you know, the nitty-gritty of knowing, right? Hence, students are slowly but surely socialized to labor as uncritical, descriptive, neutral scholars, dispassionate and disembodied in their intellectual construction of the world. I'm just going to go very, very quickly through some principles to kind of sum up, and then just a last little piece, and then we're going to do some talking back and forth with each other. You know? So critical principles then that support a pedagogy of the body oblige educators to be cognizant of the largest social, political, and economic conditions that shape their lives and the lives of students. In summary, some of these are overlapping, as they should be, these principles that we might think about. So the emotional and physical responses and experiences of students within the process of teaching and learning are engaged as meaningful indicators of strengths and challenges that students face in their intellectual formation and the development of social consciousness. So rather than seeing students behavior as somehow, you know, oh, they're just being this little badass, or they're just, you know, they're just willful. Because often I hear teachers talking about students like, oh, they're just so willful. Why? Because they're not, you know, they're not able to get them to stop or to sit. Rather than engaging that, and I'm going to use quotes, willfulness in a meaningful way, often that doesn't happen. And I mean, what's always interesting to me is the things that are left out and the things that are focused on, right? So often you hear psychologists say that all meaning, you know, all behavior has meaning. I mean, if you took psychology 101, you had to come across that notion that all behavior has meaning. But that's suddenly thrown out whenever we're dealing with students, especially working class students and students of color. Suddenly there isn't the sense that their behavior has meaning, you know. That knowledge has to be understood as being historical and collective, emanating from the body's relationship to the world. The body is primary then in the construction of knowledge and the development of moral thought, or as Connell reminds us, in the reality of practice, the body is never outside of history. The mind and its cognitive capacities are understood as only one medium for the construction of knowledge. Hence, students are seen as integral human beings whose minds, bodies, hearts, and spirits are implicated in the process of intellectual formation. That knowledge derived from the body's collective interaction with the world constitutes a significant dimension of critical educational praxis. Classroom community relationships, materials, activities must reflect then this knowledge. That teaching and learning are understood as a process of human labor that are tied to the material conditions and social relations of power that exist within classroom life. Hence, the question of power and the uses of authority have to be interrogated daily and constantly. Knowledge and construction is seen as a collective historical phenomenon which occurs continuously both within and outside of schools. To privilege school knowledge and ignore the knowledge and power of lived experience limits students' social agency and denies them opportunities to participate actively in the process of their learning. Teachers create meaningful interactions and activities within classrooms and communities that support students in grappling honestly with the tensions and consequences of differences in worldview. And often this is not done. The knowledge is a lot of talk about difference, but not a real engagement about the tensions that differences create. The knowledge that teachers have of their own bodies, including their sexuality, is an important aspect in their ability to interact effectively and to competently educate diverse student populations. Acts of resistance tied to the body can signal meaningful alternative ways of knowing and relating to the world. Conditions are created then for students to reflect, to affirm, to challenge the meanings of the acts of resistance in their lives. So often, teachers, when students are resisting, they tend to become more authoritarian. It's a default. It's not an unusual thing for teachers to become authoritarian. They feel pushed back. What I want to invite folks to think about is maybe those are the very moments when we should not be authoritarian, when we need to step back and we need to open the field of engagement so then students have an opportunity to express themselves, and we might discover that we're in fact in error about what we're thinking about a student. Spaces are created then within classrooms and communities for students to contribute to the aesthetics of physical surroundings, including the social and material conditions of their knowledge construction, their peer relationships, how they exercise their voice, how they participate. And these principles, very quickly, are just a form of a critical praxis of the body. They're inherently linked to decolonizing the body. I mean, this is what this whole discussion is really about. It's about how do we decolonize the body from educational and social constraints that repress the development of voice, disrupt democratic participation, and thwart the self-determination of disenfranchised populations in particular. This entails rewriting the body into our understanding of pedagogy through calling forth the establishment of new social, political, and economic conditions, which are also required here is an embodied, emancipatory political vision. So I just want to, my last remarks is about this sense of forging this emancipatory vision of schooling, which then calls us all back to our bodies in a world where all aspects of daily life, birth, death, marriage, family, school, work, leisure, parenthood, spirituality, and even entertainment are all monitored and controlled. This historical colonization of the body has left many of us numb, alienated, and fragmented, defenseless at the mercy of capital. The consequence, as Richard Brosho reminds us, is a deep sense of personal and collective dissatisfaction generated by a marketplace that cannot satisfy the human needs of the body. Needs that can only be met through relationships that break the alienation and isolation so prevalent in capitalist society. Through integrating principles that sustain a critical praxis of the body, teachers then can begin to create a space in which emotional intimacy can thrive. Often in teacher education, we don't talk about this issue of intimacy. In the learning and teaching process, we don't speak about a sense of intimacy. Intimacy tends to be talked about only in kind of, genital sex. I mean, I'm really, you're all adults, right? I mean, that's how it tends to be talked about, rather than talked about intimacy as simply that element of connection, of human connection, where we feel trust, where we feel faith, where we feel a sense of camaraderie, of solidarity with others. Terry Eagleton urges us to recognize that the origin of emancipatory possibility and human solidarity resides squarely in the body, for it is through the collective interactions of integral bodies within the classroom and the possibility of moral thought that moral thought can be awakened. This constitutes a very important aspect of our pedagogy, since it is moral thought that places our collective bodies back into history and into the political discourse. Moreover, it's the absence of a truly democratic moral language and practice of the body that stifles our capacity for social struggle today. For example, many educators across the country where I'm at, they bemoan. I mean, they'll talk, oh my goodness, they will talk about how horrible the conditions are that they're working in, right? Justifiably so. But the conditions often of high-stakes testing and accountability just are negatively impact their labor. However, despite all that frustration, they will not come together to struggle, to communicate a clear and coherent emancipatory moral message to challenge the shallow economistic moralism of neoliberalism. Some would argue that the lack of such a coherent political project is a direct result of teachers' alienated complicity with the status quo and the contradictions inherent in their lack of politics within a highly charged political arena. And those who know Paulo Freire's work or critical pedagogy, you know that one of the central pieces has to do with the fact that education is a political act. That the issue of politics, the issue of power, is always inherent in how we're taught to teach and how at the end we act and behave within our classrooms. Rather than exercising a language of economic efficiency and neoliberal accountability, life within schools and society requires the development of moral political language that can safeguard the dignity and integrity of all human differences intrinsic to pluralistic nations. Moreover, genuine democracy requires a body's interaction with the social and material world in ways that nurture meaningful and transformative participation. It must exist as a practice in which human beings can interact individually and collectively as empowered subjects of their lives. Throughout his life, Paulo Freire emphasized the significance of love. Many people call Paulo Freire's when they speak of pedagogy, they speak of a pedagogy of love. And he emphasized the significance of love in his work, as well as the importance of an ethics in education. But I want to make sure that you understand that I'm not talking about a sentimentalizing kind of love. I'm talking about love as a political force. That he believed that we had to bring the political force of love to our work as educators, especially if we believed that we needed to be part of the solution rather than be part of the problem. He embraced love as an emancipatory and revolutionary principle, compelling us to become part of a new decolonizing culture that nurtures human connections, intimacy, trust, and honesty from the body out to the world. In the same vein, Shapiro writes, with love we affirm and are affirmed. In the social political struggle against death from hunger, from disease, from exploitation, from war, from destruction of the earth, and against hopelessness, there is a great and growing need for our capacity to become body full of love. For Eagleton, then, love means to comprehend the moral and the material as inseparable. This constitutes an essential ingredient of a just society and the political principles that motivates our struggles for social justice and human rights. This is a love grounded in the mutuality and interdependence of our human existence. Also inherent in such a love is an understanding that we as educators are never at liberty to be violent or authoritarian. Freire repeatedly argued that ethics is a significant place of departure for both our private and public lives. The political question then, which is the final analysis, is a moral one. For without morality, our politics and pedagogy can become instruments of oppression. But this view of morality should not be confused with moralism, because it entails exploring deeply the quality of our sensations, our ideas, our practices, a process that teachers and students cannot surely accomplish by abstracting life from our social surroundings, from our cultures, or from our histories of survival. This requires that educators struggle to bring together in the classroom the moral and the political, the particular and the universal, acknowledging that nothing can survive in isolation. You know, if we're going to survive in relationship to this planet, we have to understand that this is something that we must do together. That the suffering of one impacts the suffering of all, and often that ethics is missing in how we see the world. Hence, it is through collective struggle waged in our bodies that consciousness is born. Through our actions with students, with colleagues, with comrades, we can struggle together not only for the shifting of consciousness, but for the transformation of material conditions. This requires our participation in the actual settings in which we live and work. To not act in the immediacy of our workplace and lived environment can place us in danger of living out a false consciousness that loses touch with the grief and empathetic feelings that oppression stirs in the human soul. The poet Muriel Rukeyser wrote, "A true consciousness is a confession to ourselves of our feelings. A false consciousness disowns them." Ultimately, it is this disowning that leads us to the corruption of the mind and body. Such disowning is the outcome of an overabundance of undermining representations and images in schools and society and the media that repeatedly tell poor and working class and racialized populations that they are worthless, beckoning us in a million ways to abandon ourselves to the logic of capital, as if somehow the only way that we can be true human beings is through having money, or somehow that money is going to solve all the problems. In these times, great moral courage is required to voice our dissent against educational policies and practices that betray students from oppressed communities, rendering them disposable and expendable. To transform debilitating conditions within classrooms and societies, we need a revolutionary pedagogy solidly committed to the unfettering of the body through embracing the liberation of our humanity as sensual, thinking, knowing, and feeling subjects of our history, subjects of our own lives. This entails then rewriting the body into our understanding of pedagogy through calling forth the establishment of new social, political, and economic conditions, conditions that will reap new possibilities for public schooling. Classroom conditions that begin with the primacy of the body carry radical possibilities for reconnecting students more deeply to their development as fully integral human beings. And most importantly, since the body is the material foundation of our yearning for human liberation, it is only in our bodies that we can ultimately enact a revolutionary love and change the very course of our history. Thank you.